It's good to see you. I'm the Environment Officer at St George's Church, and although I'm sort of hosting this evening, I'm not going to say very much because we've got several different speakers who we've gathered together to talk on different aspects of campaigning about climate change. So this is the running order for the evening. We've got John Swales, who I think most of you will know. And then we've got Rachel, who is, we've just established has got 3 different jobs with different organisations, but is here primarily as a representative of an organisation called Hope for the Future this evening, who's going to talk about COP26, and we'll explain what that is if you've not heard of that term before as well. And then we've got John Davey, who has a similar role to me at Gateway Church, and is here this evening to talk to us about 2 things: the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill and the proposed expansion of Leeds Bradford Airport. We'll have each of those sort of sessions talking about those things, and then we're going to have a couple of breakout sessions where you can choose which session to go to. One will be led by Rachel about engaging with your MP in different ways to do that and how to do it effectively. And then John, in parallel with that, is going to talk about civil disobedience, which John has some experience of. And then we'll join back together again and then split up into smaller groups, probably, given numbers, probably 2 groups again, to talk about how, and this is open discussion at this point, to share ideas and come up with some suggestions of how, as a group at St George's, we can campaign in different ways, and what we might do, when we might do it, how we might organise that sort of thing. So great. John, can I pass over to you to start us off?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. It's good to. There's a bit of an echo coming through there.
Sorry.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here. Over the last month or so, I've been writing 26 different prayers for the climate and ecological emergency, and I thought we could begin with one of these prayers, which has the title Trinity of Love. So let's pray. Father of creation, God of compassion, we thank you that you're a holy Trinity of love that rules and reigns with self-giving, sacrificial love. To you we give all praise, honor, and glory. In this time of climate breakdown, we ask that we would be filled with your love. For a love which in a wounded world makes a difference. Trinity of love, fill our hearts. For a love which in a warming world looks like something. Trinity of love, fill our hearts. For a love which in a culture of denial speaks truth. Trinity of love, fill our hearts. For a love which in a world of oppression and indifference challenges injustice. Trinity of love, fill our hearts. Fill our hearts, O Lord, with love for climate refugees, for those caught up in climate-related conflicts, for those suffering from extreme weather events, for those who face drought and food shortages. Father of creation, God of justice, we thank you that you are not indifferent to those who suffer injustice and oppression. We ask that in this time of climate breakdown, you would give us a holy rage, a righteous anger, which seeks to stand up, speak out, and oppose the machine of unrestrained capitalism. Father, in the name of your Son, let us be those who rebel against evil, which tramples on the vulnerable. Father, give us courage. Father, we ask that, like Jesus, our anger would come from a wellspring of holy love. We ask that our righteous love and holy anger will always be good and never turn itself into violence. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Amen. Okay, so I'm just going to pick up this topic of why campaigning, to set some of the larger context. Some of this will be familiar to us, but I think a good reminder. We are in a climate emergency. In the words of the UN Secretary General, we face a direct existential threat. Or as Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, put it, the future of the human race is now at stake. The sobering truth is that we live in a world of climate breakdown. And unless we change course drastically, we face a future which will include mass migration, mass starvation, and societal collapse. This is the context in which we find ourselves. It should not just be a sideline issue for a few people who like to ride the justice hobby horse. We need, as Pope Francis said, an ecological conversion in which the church wakes up, stands up, and faces what will be with the love and compassion of Christ. It is arguably our sacred duty to rebel against the ecological violence we are doing to nature, to the world's most vulnerable, and to future generations. In the book The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien writes these words: "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." So in a culture, in a world of climate breakdown, how should we respond? Well, in the last few climate sessions here at St. George's, we've explored a number of different important issues which can help us lower our carbon footprint, from food to fashion to transport and home insulation, by making consumer choices which include refusing, recycling, and repairing. In the perilous times in which we live, these things are really ethical no-brainers and should be part and parcel of our lives of discipleship. However, the sobering truth is that as good as these things are, they will not in themselves prevent the unfolding of a disaster of apocalyptic proportions. They will not alone keep us from a 2-degree or 3-degree world above pre-industrial temperatures. What we need is systemic change, a transformation of business as usual, or business as usual with a few tweaks. And we need to move into a new way in which society operates, a way which is compatible with human existence and the flourishing of all creation. The reality is that there are forces at work that are plunging us further into the crisis. Forces such as unrestrained capitalism and consumerism, as well as the powerful pull of denialism. This reality has resulted in the failure of many global leaders, governments, and politicians, alongside many corporate and financial institutions, to provide the necessary ethical framework and economic structure which promotes a green future and the lowering of greenhouse emissions. This moral failure and lack of ethical imagination can be seen in a multiplicity of ways. Let me name 3 of them: 1 local, 1 national, and 1 global. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up, Ewan. Is that all right? Brilliant. So, local decisions. Leeds City Council declared a climate emergency and has signed the UK 100 net zero pledge and committed to make the Leeds district carbon net zero by 2045. However, and we'll have more about this later, the council's own planning committee still voted for the expansion of flights at Leeds Bradford Airport. By 2026, an expanded airport would pump out more emissions than are allowed in the carbon budget for the whole of Leeds. So on our doorstep, unethical decisions are being made. National communications. During COVID, there have been national daily news briefings stressing the emergency situation we are in. National and local governments and media news outlets have communicated in such a way that it's shaped the consciousness of the nation. Although there have been hints here and there has been a lack of sustained and serious news reports and government briefings about climate. Many people in the UK and in our churches do not realise the full extent of what may befall us. Global targets. At COP conferences and the Paris Agreement, global leaders have made commitments to lower carbon emissions. However, even if these commitments are met, and there's debate about this, about whether they will, we are still looking at entering a 2-degree world, which will include mass migration, mass starvation, and societal collapse. Professor Stephen Harrison, Professor of the Climate and Environmental Change, University of Exeter, says this: we have all the resources we need to deal with this. There's nothing magical about reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We just don't have the political or the economic will to do so. So the system needs to change. Many governments, politicians, and major corporations and banks need to change their ways and align themselves with justice. Our economic and political systems, to avoid a world of mass suffering, need to align themselves with a more ethical course of action. And campaigning is directly related to this, as individuals and communities seek to speak truth to those in power. Campaigning seeks to bring about change in those who are the decision making. Campaigning helps us express our concern that this world is plunging into the stormy seas of climate breakdown without the necessary safeguards in place. Campaigning can take place in lots of different ways: letter writing, petitions, craftivism, boycotts, youth strikes, using social media, protests, and civil disobedience. And campaigning may involve people leaving their comfort zones. It causes us to take sides publicly, and it will require, for many of us, a transformation in our churches. No longer would we side with the status quo through an apolitical gospel, but instead we would seek to see the outworking of the gospel in prophetic ways by standing alongside the vulnerable and our global and future neighbours. So let me just name 3 successes as I wrap up now. Number 1, many banks and pension groups, including Barclays and HSBC, are investing heavily in fossil fuels. They're profiteering from projects that are not in line with the Paris agreements. Their investments mean they're profiteering from projects that will result in food shortages, sea level rise, etc. And groups such as Operation Noah and Bright Now have been campaigning for individuals, charities, and churches to divest from unethical banks and pensions. And they've had success in this campaign, often as a result of individual letters that have been written to churches, people raising the issues at PCCs and boards of governance. And only last week, the Anglican Church of Wales made a decision to divest from fossil fuels. Another success, the climate youth strikes and the protests of Extinction Rebellion helped raise the emergency level in the UK. As a direct response, and perhaps with a little help from David Attenborough and others, Parliament in May 2019 declared a climate emergency, and this was followed in turn by many local councils. Number 3, in recent months, there's been hundreds of people objecting to the expansion of Leeds Bradford Airport and the Cumbrian coal mine on ethical grounds. This has taken the form of petitions, letter writing, chatting to local MPs, and non-violent protests. And both of these projects have now been put on hold. You know, it's not for definite they're going to stop, but they've been put on hold. Campaigning can work, and it is our ethical duty, as best as we are able, to get involved. That perhaps the system will change, and we will avoid the worst of what may be. Within the Christian tradition, last sentence, and it's an important one, we may see campaigning as a form of spiritual warfare in which we engage the powers and principalities to bring about justice-shaped change. It is part and parcel of our missional mandate to love our neighbours as ourselves. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. You're getting a round of applause. Right, so next we have Rachel, who's going to talk to us about COP26.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I will just share my screen. It's lovely to be with you tonight, and this is a very quick review. I'm very happy to answer questions via email if you want to talk more about COP26 and what that means. This is a climate coalition graphic about the year ahead. We're obviously past February now. We're heading towards the UK hosting the G7 in June. There's hope for mass mobilisations in September ahead of the UK hosting COP26 in November, which should be in Glasgow. A bit of uncertainty about what it will look like because of COVID. So what is COP26? In the words of Chris Stark, who's the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, it's a major milestone. Also, the UK must have raised its own ambition with real policies and programmes to put us on a credible path to net zero. So in other words, it's really important for international governance of climate change, but it's also a really important opportunity for the UK to align itself and for us to use that as like a leverage point with the decisions being made in the UK. I'm going to skip this because of time, but you can think of COPs as kind of the Olympic Games of climate change. So it's where the governance happens for climate, and COP stands for Conference of Parties. They happen annually. One of the most famous is the one that happened in Paris back in 2015. Out of that COP came the Paris Agreement, which John referenced, where 195 countries committed to limit global warming to 2 degrees and pursue limiting it to 1.5 degrees. And it was a huge breakthrough because previously in international summits, they tried to take the amount of carbon emissions that were left and subdivide them between different countries, but politically it just wasn't being accepted. So the Paris Agreement reverses that. So under the Paris Agreement, every 5 years, countries must put forward what's called a nationally determined contribution. It's a contribution that's determined nationally by the amount of which they'll reduce their emissions and also undertake other things towards governance on climate change. And the idea is that that increases with ambition. So every 5 years, it's kind of a ratcheting mechanism up until the point that we've ended emissions globally. Out of this, the Paris Agreement came the focus on 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And then following that, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is like an international body of scientists, put together a report that took them 18 months to do. And it was focused specifically on the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And in that report, it said this: limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees compared with 2 degrees could reduce the number of people both exposed to climate-related risks and susceptible to poverty by up to several hundred million. It's a really stark example of the human impact of climate change within what is otherwise a very dense scientific report. This slide has too much information on, apologies, but on the left, you see the status quo, which is by 10 years' time, 2030, about 59 gigatons of carbon dioxide being released annually, so an increase of where we are now. With the nationally determined contributions to date, that would be reduced to 56 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which is compatible still with 3 degrees of warming this century. On the right-hand side, you see what would be needed to be compatible with 1.5 degrees. So in other words, over the next decade, we need to over half our annual global carbon emissions. These screenshots are taken from the interactive report that you can find on the United Nations Environment Programme website for their Emissions Gap Report 2020. And that report also includes the sentence that's at the bottom, which says the levels of ambition in the Paris Agreement must be roughly tripled for the 2 degrees pathway and increased at least 5-fold for the 1.5 degrees pathway. So we've got this high level ambition in the Paris Agreement that we're like so far away internationally from what that would actually look like in terms of the cuts that are needed to the status quo. So this is a personal opinion, but what would a successful COP look like? It would look like new 2030 targets in line with the pathways that we saw on the right-hand side. Because the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, happen once every 5 years, and this COP26 is the first time that countries have had to update their NDCs since Paris, and it's one of 2 times this decade that they get updated. So the raising of ambition is really important, and the UK should be using its influence to make sure that happens. Another big point is finance and debt relief. Internationally, there just isn't the provision that there needs to be on this. And as a major global financial power, the UK would be really well placed to bring forward that leadership. And finally, a strong signal that the fossil fuel era is coming to an end. 80% of our global energy is still fossil fuels. And until we change that, this isn't going to go away. We'll get better. The UK as host, there's a saying within climate diplomacy that if you host it, you own it. And unfortunately for us, the UK so far, although it's said good words, and today we had some welcome news about an increase of ambition in terms of our climate commitments and targets, we're just not putting in any of the policy recommendations that go along with that. And every year between now and 2050, which is meant to be the kind of global net zero mid-century kind of deadline, is basically 3% of our time. And that is a lot of time when you're thinking about some of the big changes that need to happen, changes like retrofitting buildings across the UK to make sure that there aren't any carbon emissions from them. And you can see just this long list of problem areas that have emerged literally within the last 12 months at a point where the UK should really be leading. And finally, just to wrap up, we do have some UK COP presidency themes, but they have been criticised for being a bit just a bit murky and not really having the sense of direction or urgency attached with them. But I'm hoping that within the next few months, we'll see some more UK leadership, particularly around areas such as finance, which is a big focus for some of the faith-based climate campaigning this year, which I'd be happy to talk with people further about. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. That was brilliant. So now we have John Davey, who's going to talk about 2 different topics. I think first you're going to talk about the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. So over to you, John. You're muted at the moment.
Muted, aren't I? Okay, thank you for inviting me. I'm fairly new to this compared with Rachel and John, who I think have been involved in these areas longer than me. As I started to become increasingly concerned about the climate and ecological challenges we face, of course, like everyone else, you start to think about your own lifestyle, which is essential to do. But ultimately, you realize that this alone is not going to cut it, as John told us very clearly. And basically, to me, it came down to this: I have to get my hands dirty in specific issues, because just words won't cut it. We have to make progress on specific things. Some bad things need to be opposed and to be stopped. Some good things need to be advocated and seen through. And so today I'm going to tell you about 2 things that I've been involved with: one for a good thing, one against a bad thing. One of the things I learned very quickly is that when you get involved in something like this, it quickly becomes very messy and very complicated. It's one thing to have lovely ideas. It's another thing to work through the details of why the airport shouldn't expand or why we might need certain kind of legislation. I also found that people have all kinds of different opinions. Christians who think the environment is important may still have different opinions, and we're going to be criticized if we start to do anything almost, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. So I'm going to share a screen now to talk, first of all, hopefully about the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. So let's see if that goes.
Yeah.
Right, so first I'm going to tell you why I like this bill, the Climate Ecological Emergency Bill. First of all, because it's a very urgent bill, it captures the urgency. We need to try to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees C. We need to commit ourselves legally to doing that. It's a very integrated bill. It deals with both the climate and more general ecological issues. These so often get separated. We talk a lot about climate. It's in the title for today, but there are many other related issues like the quality of our land and the food supply, therefore, that we can get. The legislation that's currently going through Parliament on these issues has it all split up a little bit here, a little bit there, some in the farming bill, some in the environment bill, some in other places. This brings together key issues and says we have to face them all together as one package. And then it's a just bill. I think we're all very conscious, and John has brought home to us very clearly how the impacts of climate change dramatically affect our world and affect the poor worse than everyone. It's very easy for developed nations to reduce their carbon figures and meet reduced targets simply by outsourcing those emissions down our supply chains. But actually, the CEE bill says we have to think about what it costs us all down our supply chains, both in terms of climate emissions, carbon and so on, and in terms of the environmental footprint of our activities. And so we have to count all these things in the commitments and targets that we're trying to meet. It's nature-based in the sense that there's a strong emphasis on regenerating our the created environment that we live in. We know it's been ravaged by unfettered capitalism, as John put it. And yet also there are plenty of examples around that says if we will just let nature alone and give it a chance, it can regenerate. It has a God-given capacity to regenerate. And this bill insists on a major emphasis on environmental regeneration. It's focused, and this particular point is one that some people oppose. It insists that we actually reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide particularly, and don't try to get out of reducing emissions by spending billions upon billions on technology to suck carbon out of the air. A lot of the efforts to meet carbon targets coming down to saying, let's just go on consuming as we do and do something else that in some way will offset that, maybe plant a few more trees or build something that will suck the carbon dioxide out of the air. Now, the United Nations Climate Organization say we should make very little use of these kinds of technologies, only to offset the emissions that we cannot avoid, that are unavoidable, and some are unavoidable. So the CE bill insists on that, and therefore implicitly it tackles the issue of overconsumption. And it's our overconsumption in the West over decades that has driven the crisis that we're now in. And if we're going to face this crisis, we have to reduce our consumption, and implicitly this pushes us down that route. And then finally, it's democratic. We know that right now we're very divided about these things. And if we're going to make any progress, major changes are going to make major changes to our lifestyles. And that is much better if there's a more democratic process involved in bringing the changes. So the CEE bill insists upon having a good democratic process through a citizens' assembly. So that's why I like the bill. Well, where is it at now? It's a presentation bill, a private members bill introduced in September 2020. One of the sponsors was Alex Sobel, the Leeds Northwest MP. That was the first reading. Second reading was due in March. It was deferred because the sittings were shut down because of COVID. It will be reintroduced in the next parliamentary session. And many people say it's unlikely to become law. And the reason is that private members' bills rarely do and rarely even get a debate. But there is a precedent for private members' bills becoming law. And one of the best precedents is the 2008 Climate Act, which was, although we may now see it as rather inadequate at the time, was groundbreaking and world-leading genuinely. And that started as a private members' bill. But it eventually became an actual act because it gained widespread support, and the government at the time took it on board and supported it. And therefore, there is a campaign out now to gain widespread support for this bill. What, gone the wrong way, sorry. So this brings me to the CE Bill Alliance, the campaigning group that is for this. I'm basically trying to increase public and parliamentary support. Currently, 108 MPs publicly support the bill. That's from all parties except Conservative, sadly, the great omission. It is the official policy for the Dems, for Green, for Plaid Cymru, the Alliance, SDLP. Sadly not at present for the Labour Party. 31 local councils support it in that they've passed motions in their council to formally support it and call upon the government to enact this. And 104 organisations of various kinds, including Christian Climate Action, the Quat Bank, Oxfam, and many others, also support this. So there is growing support. When I first joined the Alliance in September, there were only 20 some MPs. Now there's 108. At Easter, there were only 99, I think. There is growing support. So what's actually happening in terms of campaigning at present? One of the big issues is lobbying MPs, because one of the keys is to get enough MPs to support. If you write to a Conservative MP, you will get a letter back that will say something like, yes, this is a very important issue. Happily, our government is doing everything that is needed, which is so blatantly ludicrous that we hardly need to discuss it here, I think. If you write to a Labour MP, you may get a better response. You will certainly get, yes, we agree this is very serious. There are good things in this bill, but the Labour Party is going to bring forward its own proposals, which is all very well, but that's going to be several years ahead before that can effectively happen. And so there continues to be pressing MPs to support this publicly. Lobbying local councils to other councils to I've written to local councillors, didn't get a reply, asking them to put a motion into council to support the CWE bill. We can ask more and more organisations to support. There have been banner drops in Leeds. Extinction Rebellion organised a banner drop on the 26th of March, which was the date there should have been the second reading. Today, an open letter to the Prime Minister was published that came from over 100 academics and organisational leaders from around the country. So there's a lot of things currently going on. Which brings me on now next to the Leeds Bradford airport expansion. This obviously is against something, and probably you know most of this, but we'll just briefly say last year LBA's Australian investment group owners put in a planning application for a new net zero terminal, which has got a lot of publicity. What a great idea. What is not generally mentioned is that that goes along with a 72% passenger increase to justify it. Despite a lot of lobbying, this was approved by the Council City Plans panel on February 11th. I watched most of the 8-hour meeting. I have to say it was a model of bad process and probably cynical, or maybe cynical, but to say stitch up, it was predetermined, clear that the council wanted this to happen. A minority of councillors opposed it and spoke up to oppose it, but it was passed. Subject to conditions, on the March 11th, they discussed the conditions, whether the airport would meet the conditions. In fact, the airport wasn't meeting the conditions, and even some of the things they'd said they'd do up February 11th, they backtracked on. Nevertheless, it was confirmed. And so It then had to be referred to the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, because it's being built on Greenbelt land, and he then had about 3 weeks in which to either approve it or call it in for a public inquiry, as has happened with the colliery in Cumbria. And on April 6th, he said, I need longer. And so the decision was deferred indefinitely. And we don't know whether he will approve or call it in. And we don't know when that's going to happen. So I think I ought to say why I am against this expansion. And I need to say it because I've come across a lot of Christians who think it's a great idea. I'm against it for the climate issues. It's going against any kind of national targets. It's going against local targets, as was mentioned earlier. Soon the airport itself will consume more than Leeds' carbon budget if this goes ahead. Interestingly, in the discussions in the City Plans panel, this was almost totally ignored. Glibly said it's well within emissions. The fact of aircraft emissions was not taken into account. This was kind of sidestepped by saying, well, that's a national issue, so it's not something we're going to think about. There's health hazards that come from pollution and come from noise, and these were largely ignored despite a wealth of expert evidence. I think also it's a drastic economic mistake at a time when there are realistic ways that we can recalibrate our economy in a greener fashion and invest in different ways of living, making a living, developing our region. We're tying ourselves or committing ourselves back to the failed carbon-centered thing that is going to bring disaster to the planet. It's an economic mistake. But this is the main argument that the airport and people in the council were making. We need it for the jobs. And so it's almost like saying, yes, we know there's problems, but we need the jobs. And many Christians I've spoken to have said, yeah, that's right. But it's not an issue of climate versus jobs. There are much better ways to develop our economy than building this airport. The problem is we live in a system that is failing us. We can't think of any other way, and we need to give space to creative thinking to make a new, more positive way forward. And this loses all that possibility. So I joined a group called GALBA, Group for Action on LBA. What we've been doing so far, lobbying city councillors extensively. But once the council had passed its decision, that was not so important. Lobbying MPs. Happily, all the 5 Labour MPs have clearly opposed this. The Conservative MPs around the fringes have been much more kind of keeping their powder dry. Lobbying Robert Jenrick, because he is the man who will make a decision as to whether there's a public inquiry. Lobbying Alok Sharma, the COP26 president. In theory, he should have no input into this, but it's all part of political pressure onto the powers that be to recognise that something significant needs to happen. And the fact that this is an embarrassment to the UK as presidents of COP26 is a lobbying point. There have been a lot of press releases have gone out, a lot of letters written by individuals to newspapers, some very good letters. There have been social media campaigns. On March 26, many GALBA members posted on social media short videos saying why they were opposing the airport expansion. If there is an independent inquiry, GALBA will be represented by a specialist environmental barrister. If the Secretary of State doesn't allow an independent inquiry, then almost certainly I think GALBA will begin a judicial review, because there are so many flaws in the process that's been gone through so far that can be challenged legally. But an independent inquiry will be better, because an independent inquiry will require the climate issues to be properly examined. a judicial review only can challenge on points of law. Either of those ways, independent inquiry or judicial review, will require a lot of money. So Galba is also fundraising and doing fairly well on that. So having introduced those two things that I've been part of, I just want to make some final points that are convinced me about campaigning. And the first is that this is not just a secular agenda. This is God's world that is being destroyed. It is the people in God's world, and particularly the poor, who are being damaged by what is happening. There is a huge issue of injustice and compassion here. This is God's issue. We can go into this wholeheartedly as the Lord's people, as his children. And therefore, we can bring a very specific Christian contribution that we can pray. And Proverbs 21, verse 1 says, the king's heart is in the Lord's hand. He turns it like a watercourse in whichever direction he wants. And so here is something where we can unite in prayer, not to use prayer as an excuse for inaction, but to pray and act together. And I still think there's a sleeping giant to wake up here in the church, that we pray. And that we pray at a national and international level. Pray for those in authority, as we're commanded to in Timothy, for peace. And we will not have peace in our world unless this issue is addressed. And then this is part of our engagement in mission. When I started getting involved with these organizations, in which I did find a few Christians, including Izzy, who's on this call, who's part of Galba, I went consciously saying, Lord, I go as your ambassador here. And I'm going to mix with a group of people where there are probably not many Christians, or historically, and who, for reasons of our own failure as churches, may well see Christians as the enemy. But I've been very open about who I am or why I'm here. I've talked about praying, and now one of the people who is not a Christian in the CEE Bill Alliance sends me prayer requests. Finally, I just want to say, yeah, we're talking kind of theory to that tonight in a sense, but it is a time for action. The more, the merrier. I hope that some of us here tonight will be able to get more involved in these or other current hot issues. So thank you for having me and listening to me, and I will stop there.
Thank you so much. Another change of voice. It's me popping up. Most of you know me, I'm Izzy. Yeah, thank you for all the contributions so far. Just yeah, really inspiring. So so we're going to talk next about ways to campaign and getting practical about how we might campaign. As Ewan mentioned, we're going to have 2 breakout rooms where we have a chance to go in depth into one type of campaigning. But we just wanted to recognise before we do that there are also many other types of campaigning. So I've just literally just got a few minutes just to kind of have a zoom through. So yeah, just sort of briefly thinking, you know, who are our targets of campaigning, you know, and I was thinking it's really anyone in power at any level. There may well be something, or there's likely to be something they can do about climate change, because it's something, you know, climate change is an issue that, you know, touches every area of life and our society. So, you know, we basically, we may have campaigns targeting anyone in power at any level, whether that's world leaders or, you know, the chairman of the local cricket club. You know, it might be that we want an organisation that we're involved with at a local level to use an ethical bank account that's not investing in fossil fuels, or we might be targeting Boris Johnson, the government. So, or we might be in those positions of power ourselves and able to make some of those changes. And I also just put on here the public, because I do think also there's a role in terms of raising awareness in the general public about climate change, because awareness levels are probably quite low, really. And so it's awareness raising is maybe slightly separate issue to campaigning, but it's also an important one to think about. And when we have some discussion later about what we can do, maybe we also want to think about how we can raise awareness in our communities as well as campaigning. And just in terms of examples of ways to campaign, I mean, there are many. Some people have touched on them already. I literally just put a few slides together, some things I thought of off the top of my head. So yeah, marches, meeting decision makers. This is actually a photo from the Leeds Diocese website of people from Roundhay churches meeting Fabian Hamilton at the Houses of Parliament about climate change. Yeah, petitions, social media, civil disobedience, vigils and public kind of demonstrations, strikes, letter writing, public stunts. This is Greenpeace is quite famous for using fake polar bears in public stunts. This is one outside a theatre in America somewhere which is being funded by some kind of oil magnate. I thought that was quite a clever one. Legal challenges, that's becoming a much bigger thing now. If anyone's interested in that, there's an organisation called Climate Earth, which is doing quite a lot about legal challenges against governments for not taking action on the climate. Arts and media, this is quite a clever little craftivism thing, this sort of sewn railway ticket from a stitch in at train stations looking at the issues on public transport. Banners, adverts, you know, you name it, there's a way to campaign. So I suppose I just wanted to make the point that there's probably a way to campaign that suits every kind of skill set and personality set. There's a role for everybody, whether that's doing something kind of bombastic like dressing as a polar bear in the street, or whether it's kind of quietly, diligently writing a letter, you know, behind closed doors. So there's something for everyone. So we are going to go into the optional breakout rooms. These are your options. So you can join Rachel talking about effective engagement with your MP. Is there anything else you want to say about that, Rachel, in terms of what you're covering?
We'll be doing quite like discussion based, but yeah, we'll give some useful tips.
Great. And then John's going to do something on civil disobedience. Anything you want to add, John?
You won't be arrested for attending this session.
I really want to know what kind of glue they use at Extinction Rebellion, but anyway, yeah, that's my question.
Very quickly about why meet your MP, go through some case studies and how to contact your MP and ask some questions. So to start with, when I talk with anybody about parliamentary engagement and talking with your MP, but also other local decision makers, I usually get back some things like this. My MP just sticks with the party line. I don't know enough to talk to an MP about whatever it is that I do care about, and I wouldn't know what to ask. I hear it's only one MP, so they can't really do that much. I just don't want to. And if any of these are lurking in your mind, I completely understand, but I also hope that this session will give you a bit of food for thought for some of these. We have really successful examples of MP engagement with lots of different MPs on a cross-party basis, and where we give lots of training to people on how to talk to their MPs, what to ask, and the most rewarding part of my job is accompanying people to MP meetings where they come out of it feeling really energized and confident and be like, oh, I want to do that again. Like, this is amazing. I've just seen that my MP do something in Parliament, and I know that they did it because I met with them and I asked them to. And that's really rewarding. I'm going to just reshare my screen and we're going to watch a very short clip, which is like a mock version of like a nightmare MP meeting, and we'll have a bit of discussion about what goes wrong. So watch it with that kind of perspective. Sometimes when I share my screen, the video is a bit jumpy for people, but you should be able to hear the audio. And it's just short, it's 3 minutes long, so we will see how we go.
so sorry I'm late. It's a pleasure to meet you. Please do take a seat. Where have you come from today?
Broomhill.
Broomhill, lovely part of town. I lived there until very recently myself. Well, let me tell you a bit about myself. Fortunately, I haven't got a great deal of time today because I'm running late, so I'm sorry about that. But really, over the next period of time that we have together, I will just be here to listen to what you have to say, and I can't make any promises, but really to serve. That's how I see my role. It's my pleasure to serve in this community. So you just fire away, and I'll see what I can do. One thing I will say, you didn't come by car, did you? I mean, I'm actually a cyclist myself, but on the rare occasion that I do come by car, I really struggle for parking, but...
I cycled as well.
Of course you did, Sarah. Well, yeah, you just go ahead.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. So I was recently in Peru and...
what an amazing part of the world. How long were you there for?
2 months.
2 months, amazing. And what was it you doing? Just travelling? Or?
I was doing some volunteer work.
Very admirable, Sarah. I've always wanted to go. I've never actually found the time. Was it in the capital that you were?
In Lima.
Yeah, I'm very, very jealous, very jealous. But anyway, I believe I'm interrupting you. Do go on.
Yeah, so anyway, while I was out there, I noticed the devastating effects that climate change is having on the country and the people there.
Well, of course, but just to respond to the point that you're making there, we're so fortunate, aren't we, in a country like this that we don't have to worry about that sort of thing. But I'm sure over there it must be very concerning, and the issue certainly has my sympathy.
It is very worrying. But anyway, so, I've noticed some of the damaging policy changes that the government's making to do with climate change, and I just wanted to come and talk to you and see what the government's
I think the government's been absolutely outstanding on climate change, and we had that agreement in Paris a couple of years ago. It was every country in the world coming together and saying, we're going to do something about this, and to limit global warming. I believe it was to 2 degrees, absolutely. And I'll tell you what, Sarah, Britain was at the forefront of that.
But even with the Paris Agreement, we're still going to see some really damaging effects of climate change. And, we're not even on track to meet those targets anyway. And you're my MP. You're supposed to represent me. What are you doing about it?
Well, I mean, I'll level with you, Sarah. I think, it's really important that when you come to things like this, you bring correct information and factual information. But what I'd like to say to you is, when I leave a room, I switch the light bulb off. I've already told you I'm a keen cyclist. I've just found this fantastic new washing up liquid. It's called E-Couver. I'd highly recommend it to you. And what I'm really trying to say to you, just to respond to this point, is, I'm doing things about this issue. I'm sure you are too. And I'm not saying this is you, Sarah, but people come in here and say, why isn't the government doing this? Why isn't the government doing that? And of course, everyone has their pet issue, don't they? The NHS, climate change, whatever it is. And actually the government's doing our bit, and it's really important that you are also doing your bit, that the public is doing their bit. So that would
people are dying.
Yeah.
Right, so what did we think? So we've identified that actually there's a set of kind of behaviours that are defensive on both sides here. So you have the MP who comes in, they're late, she got her phone out, she's not really listening, she pulls the conversation away from what the constituent wants to say, she talks kind of about personal decision making rather than anything to do with policies. She's not really listening or engaging with the constituent at all. Equally, on the constituent side, you see her get very frustrated at the end when she says, people are dying. You can see clearly that the conversation has gone past the point of being constructive. And she opens with Peru, which in fairness to the MP is not the MP's constituency. And she's also goes in from an angle of sort of attacking the government's line, and immediately that will get the MP feeling defensive. There's no job descriptions for MPs. They will be thrown into a myriad of different situations, and it's therefore not surprising that actually they will have had horrible meetings with constituents who've been very cross at them, and so they will come in feeling a bit defensive. And so when you're meeting with an MP or other local decision maker, you need to think first about where they're coming from, what their perspective is, and then you need to be like, okay, how can we angle this in such a way that the MP is going to want to act and want to collaborate with this? and how do we frame the conversation in a really clear way that has like a sense of direction, a clear ask, where you're working together and building a relationship with the person you're meeting rather than just getting cross and you like breaking down the conversation over time. And so that's really the focus of the work that we do at Hope for the Future, is helping people frame those conversations in collaborative ways, say specific things to their MPs and build that relationship over time. I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to have to skip some slides, but that's okay. We can roll with that. But yeah, we'll just go from where we left off a little bit. So this is the approach that we take at Hope for the Future. It's a relationship-based approach, which starts from a position of research. From the research, you find an element of common ground with whoever it is that you're meeting. So I guess it's that way of breaking down from like the big, all-encompassing problem that you want to talk about in a way into something that you know when you sit in front of your MP will really resonate with things they're already working on and the perspective they already have. Defining a smart agenda, that is just about defining what your ask is, and then finally making sure that you prepare for conversation. So in some ways, really quite simple. There are a few case studies, maybe I'll just go through one or two. We work with lots of MPs over time. Alex Chalk was one of them, someone that we met early on in his parliamentary career, and constituents said he just holds onto the party line, there's no point. But they did want to persevere, they had another meeting, we helped them think about something specific to ask him, which he agreed to. They then set up a school workshop, meeting with sixth form campaigners who presented him with some of their presentations and thoughts on climate change. And then this was followed up with a local event on the specific topic of solar energy, which he was very happy to attend. And that was the first time that he really was like, oh, maybe the government could do a bit more. And actually this has ended really positively because he was one of the MPs who introduced the net zero legislation into Parliament. And you can see that on his website, he put a comment about how important it was to meet with constituents. And he said, never more so when it comes to the existential issue of climate change. And the Alex that we first met would not have been referring to climate change as existential. So it's this kind of movement over time and engaging MPs in different creative ways that really we find works best. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these. And maybe also just to say that even within the current situations of COVID, we've still been facilitating lots of really successful parliamentary engagement, but over Zoom. So it's still very possible to meet with your MP, and in some ways might be a bit easier because you don't have to arrange any of the like transport and logistics and getting there and that sort of thing. So just briefly to go through this in maybe a couple of minutes. We say designing a presentation without your audience in mind is like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern. So this is all about, research is all about working out what your MP cares about already. One of the really good resources is Hansard, which is just a transcript of everything that happens in Parliament. And you can put your own MP's name in and it will pull up everything they've ever said. And we really encourage people to think about not just what your MP likes to talk about, but how and what values they might have to underpin that work. And also Hope for the Future, as a charity, we can offer some very like tailored support. So if you want to contact your MP, and you will help you secure an MP meeting, and at the point that you've got an MP meeting, we will help put together a strategy for approaching your MP with some background and their areas of interest, and also the specifics of what you might want to ask them. So yeah, you're trying to work out what does your MP feel about the issue, and then roughly place them along this scale, and then you're working out, okay, I think I know what my MP's agenda is now. I don't know my agenda, so what is it that ties into both of those? And an example from Jason McCartney, MP, who I know is relatively local, might be that he's worked in the RAF. He's chair of an all-party parliamentary group on fair trade. He's very keen on emphasising local connections and has already spoken a bit about planning reforms. I literally found this out in about 5 minutes. So in which case, because of his interest in trade, I'd be talking with him about the connections between trade and climate. And I'd also be talking about planning regulations and maybe the links between the local and national level and how the government needs to be combining those two things. I won't go into this, but just to say there are lots of different specific parliamentary mechanisms that you can use to talk with your MP, and we will help you navigate those. And you should tailor that to whatever it is your MP is interested in. And the key really is making it personal and making it local. And this is an example of a recent constituent who did a really great job of writing in, because she attached a photo of her church, and that was just a really nice touch. And then this is sort of the kind of overview of where you're taking your engagement. We always advise meeting because it's where you can have an actual dialogue, and it's where you can also get an MP to actually commit to an action within Parliament in a way that is just so much harder over a letter or email or whatever else it is. And then it's just a case of being your wonderful normal self and following up and thanking, and then looking to keep your MP accountable to anything they've committed to, and then making a plan for further engagement down the line. And that's really where we see the most successful engagement is constituents who build a relationship based on common ground and then keep it up. And as they go, they establish a level of trust with their MP that makes it so much easier to get their MP to take action because their name is known to the MP, and they have a good relationship. So that has been the fastest that I've ever done this sort of session. So there's so much I haven't said, but I would love to hear just your questions and answers, and that's what we will do in the remaining time. And you're very welcome to always get in touch with me and ask me questions. Great.
Civil disobedience, is it a Christian, should Christians break the law? Let's begin with what do we mean by breaking law? We could mean by sitting in a road. We could mean gluing yourself to a bank window. What about hitting things with hammers? Should Christians ever do that? Well, let me just give you one example. At the dead of night on the 29th of January 1996, 3 women, Andrea, Joanna and Lotta, broke through the perimeter fence that surrounds the British aerospace factory at Wharton in Lancashire. They slipped past security guards, went into a runway hangar containing a Hawk jet number ZH955. They forced open the door and then using household hammers, they smashed £12 million worth of the plane's sophisticated electronics. These are ordinary people. Angie was part of a Green Party. A couple of them were Christians. One was a physiotherapist and a nurse, and another a gardener and a cleaner from different social backgrounds. They waited till the morning when the security guards arrived, and they danced with joy and prayed as they were being arrested. Well, surely this does not sound right for Christians to be involved in this. These sort of the background context was 500 million. There was a £500 million arms trade contract which the UK had with Indonesia, and Indonesia were committing crimes of genocide against the people of East Timor. This is what one of the people arrested said. Above all else in life, we are called to be human. I can therefore not stand aside and allow the hawks to be delivered without doing all that is in my power to peacefully resist. I believe that to be silent in this situation is to be complicit with injustice. I pray that what we do today in disarming these planes will be a small ray of hope for our sisters and brothers struggling for peace and justice in East Timor. They went to court, and they said, we're pleading not guilty on the basis that we had lawful excuse as we were acting to prevent British aerospace and the British government from aiding and abetting genocide. So basically they did something which normally would be seen as a crime, but they're saying in this case it's not, because it would be like smashing a window to prevent a fire, someone dying from a fire inside. Sort of it's the law of necessity. And they were, they were found not guilty. They were acquitted on the grounds that they were acting out of necessity and in a proportionate way to the crimes which were being committed in East Timor. They were highlighting the complicity of British Aerospace and the government in crimes against humanity. And they acted prophetically and spoke truth to power. So there's an example of some Christians breaking the law in a very unusual way. And actually, when it went to court, they were acquitted. So what is civil disobedience? Dr. Simon Kittle, who was at St. George's, a friend of mine through his climate work, and we both authored some chapters in this book you see on the screen, which is called Time to Act. In fact, St. George's, folks, it was my Revelation sermons, which I did a couple of years back, which are actually chapters in this book. It's the easiest chapter I've ever written in a book. They just took my sermon notes and tidied them up and put them in. But anyway, that's a good book to go to look at these things. It's written by people involved in Christian climate action. So Simon Kittle says that civil disobedience is a considered, public, non-violent breach of the law. It could include things like refusing to pay taxes, blocking or occupying buildings or roads, striking from work or school, hitting things with hammers, and other forms of non-cooperation with the state. And I've been involved, and Stuart here and Sarah as well have been involved in various sort of acts of civil disobedience, including sitting on a road and blocking it in Leeds city centre. So far, non-arrestable. Well, there's a biblical mandate. There's a number of biblical examples of people breaking the law, and they've been held up as examples of faithful people acting to obedience to God, rather than being sort of disobedient lawbreakers. Let me just go through a few examples here. In Exodus 15, we have the Hebrew midwives. The king of Egypt commands the Hebrew midwives Shiphrah and Puah to kill babies if they are born. But, and this is the first recorded case of civil disobedience in the Bible, they refuse to do this. In fact, the text says the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. In Daniel 3, we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Everyone's told to bow the knee to the golden statue, but they refuse, and they are thrown into the fire, but God delivers them. In Matthew chapter 2, the wise men are told explicitly by Herod to find out where the baby Jesus is born and come back here and tell us where he is. But they ignore this order and they return home via a different route. In Acts chapter 4, we have Peter and John. There's other New Testament examples here of people who are thrown in prison for preaching the gospel. And then we have a few examples of Jesus. In Mark chapter 2, we have the first account of sort of Jesus' public ministry. His public ministry is getting going. And what does he do? He breaks the law about picking grain on the Sabbath. And he does it in a public way with the Pharisees watching, because there's something about the confrontation which is setting the kingdom agenda. And then most famously of all is Jesus going into the temple. Remember, Jesus arrives at Jerusalem and he weeps. He weeps because he knows what will befall the city. He knows they're on a crash course for a crash collision with Rome, with the war in AD 17. He weeps when he knows what will befall them. And then he goes into the temple, and he, which is the center of the religious, economic, political life, and he overturns tables in a symbolic act, and he says, you know, you have made it a den of lesti, which is a den of those who rob with violence, a den of terrorists. You're supposed to be a light to the nations. This is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. And Jesus does this act of civil disobedience, which leads to the cross. More recently, Martin Luther King, obviously not a biblical example, in the 50s, he brought a seismic impact on race relations. He was arrested 5 times. He actually went in I think it's like an 8-year period from being one of the most hated men in the US to being a Nobel Peace Prize winner, realizing that actually it was only by, in a sense, people putting him in, creating a national shame where ordinary people were getting arrested in the face of police brutality, which shook the conscience of the nation. Other examples from history would include the suffragettes, India gaining independence through Gandhi and his non-violent resistance. Imagine what bloodbath would have ensued if it wasn't by peaceful, non-violent protest that it happened. Another example, more in my own time, is the poll tax. Wasn't particularly popular where I was brought up in County Durham. People used to say that it was the billionaire Duke of Westminster would pay the same tax as his chauffeur. And by the end of 1990, 4 million people had refused to pay the poll tax. Hundreds had been thrown in jail. And this basically led to the poll tax being sort of overthrown. The system, in the sense, had been paralysed by people not engaging with it. Okay, so there's some examples in history, and I'm saying this so ethically. I don't think Christians in all situations should rule out from the off involved in civil disobedience. For instance, what about in Nazi Germany? Would it have been appropriate? Would it have been right? In fact, most of the German church didn't speak out against the Nazis, but some did, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who we'll hear from in a minute. And more than a suggestion is that the climate crisis is such an emergency that it warrants this kind of action. So let me just talk you through the logic of why I'm in a position where I'm prepared to be arrested for civil disobedience for climate stuff. Number one, accept the truth of the level of the emergency. We are facing a catastrophe of apocalyptic proportions. I said this in the opening, a future of mass migration, mass starvation, and societal collapse. We're talking about millions of people suffering. I mean, and starving to death. In fact, millions doesn't do it justice, say billions. This is a justice issue of the highest importance. The United Nations has estimated that we need to reduce carbon emissions by half within a decade to have a 50% chance of avoiding global catastrophe. So we need to know that the absolute reality, and sometimes when I say this future of mass migration, mass starvation, societal collapse, some people are going to think, John's, he's on the kind of apocalyptic bandwagon here. Actually, this is based in the latest and peer-reviewed science. And it's because we like to soften the truth to make it more palatable. Secondly, research and recognise the failure of the government and unethical corporations and financial institutions. Let me be clear here that I'm not saying that all corporations and financial institutions are unethical. The unethical ones are the ones who are being unethical, if you get what I mean. Over many decades, the science has been clear, and people have objected through petitions and letter writing. And we've actually seen things get worse. More than 50% of all industrial CO2 emissions in the atmosphere have been produced in the last 30 years. So we've been doing petitions. People have been going on marches, and things have actually got worse. During this time, the last 30 years, our governments, whether they be Labour or Tory, have done very little to address this, and they seem complicit in their support for unrestrained capitalism. And the first duty, the dog even agrees with me here, the first duty of a government is to protect and safeguard the lives of its citizens. Arguably, our current political system has failed to do this. Let me speak about corporations. 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. Just 100 companies, 71% of global emissions. Last year, there was a leaked report from JP Morgan, which is the largest financer of fossil fuel industries. This is a leaked report from their economists, and they say this: we cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes where human life as we know it is threatened. Carbon emissions in the coming decades will continue to affect the climate for centuries to come in a way that is likely to be irreversible. There are major billion-dollar corporations and finance companies who know exactly what they are doing. They are provoking irreversible climate change. In other words, there are corporations and banks which know the science but keep on doing business as usual. In the future, we will see that governments and corporations which know the science and still pump out emissions will be tried in courts for ecocide and crimes against humanity. But we're not yet in that place. So here's the third thing. Christians should rebel against this injustice, incompetence, and profiteering. We need to stand against the powers to bring about systemic change. If the system doesn't change, the world will face mass suffering. So if we're to rebel, what's an effective way to rebel? History has shown that civil disobedience by large parts of the population can bring about systemic change and bring it around quickly enough. This isn't something we can kick into the long grass. Civil disobedience can raise awareness. It can bring disruption to the government or corporation, which, if the disruption is long enough and raises awareness and highlights the problem, it can bring about change. JP Morgan, interestingly enough, a couple of weeks ago, have said they're going to stop investing in fossil fuels. A large-scale peaceful protest involving arrests can reach a tipping point in which the general public see the sacrifice which ordinary citizens are willing to make to safeguard the well-being of humanity. And civil disobedience allows the issues to be raised in court. That's the argument for necessity. A few years ago, 7 people went to the headquarters of Shell and threw loads of paint at the windows and put loads of posters up, and they were arrested. And I think they smashed some glass as well. And they ended up in the Crown Court. And although the judge yesterday said the law is clear, they're guilty, the jury, made up of ordinary citizens, found them to be not guilty. Ordinary people are sometimes able to see through and see the issue in a different way that our legal systems and our financial and political systems can't. So, let me end with a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a few pictures, and then 3 or 4 minutes of questions. Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself, who was killed by the Nazis, who was one of, a handful of voices of church leaders speaking out against the Nazis, he said this: "We are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself." And so I've been involved in a number of protests, civil disobedience. There's one there. That's my daughter trying to wake me up because she thinks I've collapsed or something outside of Trinity Shopping Centre. And this is called a die-in there. Just something visual that people can, because people do not realise the level of emergency that we are in. And there's a few other pictures here as well, including protests with Extinction Rebellion down in London and protest against Barclays here in Leeds. So, a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I was just aware of the time and I want to sort of cram a fair bit in. What questions do people have? You can just ask them straight, or you can stick them in the chat function if I get that open.
think my question, I think it's a question, probably more of a comment really. The fact that we've got COP26 and we've got people like Boris Johnson making promises about carbon reduction and all this sort of thing. Do you think that makes it, in a sense, harder to get the message across? Because there's a sense in which people feel it is being sorted.
Yes, yes and no. I mean, I think sometimes we've got to speak the truth, even if it's unpalatable to people. I think there's an option if the government are making targets to hold them account to it. One thing you can say is, why so late in the day? Why are we at the 26th COP conference? That's 26 years of discussing this, where emissions have been increasing. Has there been an utter failure of the political system to address it until the time COP comes here? So hold them to account. With Boris Johnson, and again, why should it feel like Christians and vicars shouldn't say this? He's failed the nation in regard to the COVID crisis. Yep, he hasn't followed early on the science and whatever, and there's been profiteering as well taking place. And you know, I think it's time that Christians get that political voice, obviously backed up by research. This isn't just, you know, casting mud at everyone, but you know, we're in a dire situation. I think COP gives a real opportunity for focused attention. And one of the things with civil disobedience, it's not about whether people think that me shouting at Barclays is a good idea or not. The fact that people talk about me shouting at Barclays, talking about the injustice which Barclays are doing, and that's probably not the best way, does some of the work itself. You know, the job of those involved in civil disobedience isn't to become popular. It's to bring about change. There's a cross to be carried in regard to this as well.
I think I learned from the young people, particularly about protesting about justice for animals too. They often turn up in pictures, you know, with masks of badgers and polar bears and what have you. And I think Greenpeace are quite good. There's been an awful, I think that the animal and loss of species has come in here and there today, but not as much as I would like to see it, because I think they, you know, we share the planet with animals and we need to talk about their suffering as well.
Absolutely, this is a climate and ecological emergency. And although the focus has been a lot on sort of human plight, you know, we're all interlinked, and the way we're treating non-human worshippers is a disgrace. With young people have taken the lead in this, and as I said before, through civil disobedience, leaving school and doing school strikes with Extinction Rebellion, it brought about, almost in a very direct causal way, Parliament declaring climate emergency. And civil disobedience isn't always, you know, moody, shouty vicars outside a bank or whatever. They can be fun, creative acts. There's joy in the place as well. And, you know, I had no qualms in taking my kids down to Extinction Rebellion in Leeds, because it was just a beautiful, creative atmosphere when they took over a bridge there.